The cool night air felt like a hollow promise against my skin. I stepped back into the restaurant because I forgot my phone on the table. When I came back, the waitress locked the door and whispered, "Be quiet. I will show you the camera footage above the table. But promise me you won't pass out." What my son did on that video made me drop to my knees. The grainy black and white monitor showed a monster wearing my child's face. Lily's hand gripped my shoulder as the screen flickered. The dining room was a tomb of stacked chairs and dim shadows. On the recording, I saw myself stand up and walk away to the restroom. The second I left the frame, Jason's posture shifted. He stopped pretending to be the concerned son. He looked around with a predator's precision before reaching into his dark blazer. He pulled out a small glass vial that caught the light. He wasn't smiling anymore. My breath hitched as I watched him tilt my wine glass. He poured the clear liquid with a steady hand. He didn't hesitate or tremble. Beside him, his wife Melissa watched with a bored expression. She didn't stop him. She didn't look away. Instead, she laughed when he began to mimic my dizzy spells. He mocked my weakness with a cruel, jerky dance of his hands. They were celebrating my decline while the poison settled into the dregs of my cabernet. The audio hissed to life, filling the storage room with a terrible clarity. Jason's voice was cold and sharp. He told Melissa that a few more doses would erase my memory for good. He joked about the company being ripe for the taking. He said I was too stubborn to die but too fragile to lead. Hearing those words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I looked at my hands and realized my tremors were gone. Pure fury replaced the fear. I stood up slowly, leaning against the cold metal shelves. The waitress looked at me with pity, but I didn't want it. My mind was suddenly a sharpened blade. I realized the fatigue and the loss of my sense of smell were not accidents of age. They were chemical signatures of a betrayal. My son was killing the founder to inherit the crown. I checked my pulse and felt a steady, rhythmic thrum. I was not dying today. I was just beginning to fight. I thanked Lily and handed her a roll of cash from my purse. She tried to refuse, but I pressed it into her palm. I told her to keep the footage safe and stay silent. The streetlights outside seemed brighter as I walked toward my car. I could almost smell the ozone in the air despite the blockers in my system. I would play the part of the fading mother for just a little longer. The trap was set. Jason just didn't know it yet. I drove home through the black streets with a terrifying focus. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every breath felt like a calculated choice. I needed to reach my private laboratory before the poison fully clouded my mind. The keypad beeped and the heavy garage door groaned open, revealing a sanctuary of glass and steel. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was a scientist first. I had to prove what the camera had already shown me. The laboratory smelled of nothing, a sterile void that mocked my professional life. I reached for a clean beaker and drew a small sample of my own blood. My vision blurred for a second, but I blinked the haze away. I set the centrifuge to spin. The high-pitched whine of the machine filled the silence of the room. I waited in the dim light, watching the glass vials rotate. The machine finally stopped with a sharp, mechanical click. I was trembling. The results appeared on the monitor in jagged blue lines. A synthetic receptor blocker was present in high concentrations. It was a sophisticated compound designed to target the olfactory bulb. My son had not just poisoned my body. He had surgically removed my ability to perceive my own life's work. It was a cruel, poetic theft. I looked at the data and felt a cold stone settle in my stomach. The damage was temporary, but the intent was permanent. I heard a key turn in the front door. Jason was home early. I quickly turned off the monitors and threw a cloth over the centrifuge. My heart raced as footsteps echoed down the hallway. He called my name with that same artificial sweetness I had seen on the video. I sat on a stool and forced my shoulders to slump. I needed to look like a woman who was finally giving up. He stepped into the lab, smelling of expensive gin. "Mom, you should be in bed," he said softly. He walked closer, his eyes scanning the equipment for any signs of my suspicion. I rubbed my temples and kept my voice low and shaky. I told him the dizziness was getting worse. I claimed that I couldn't even smell the ammonia on the counter. A flash of triumph crossed his face before he masked it with concern. He reached out to pat my hand. His touch felt like a snake's skin. He told me we should finalize the legal papers tomorrow morning. He argued that the stress was clearly destroying my health. I nodded slowly. playing the role of the defeated matriarch. I watched him relax as he believed his victory was secured. He poured me a glass of water from the dispenser, but I saw his fingers brush against his pocket. He was already preparing the next dose. He handed me the glass with a small, encouraging smile. I took the water and pretended to sip it as he turned away. I watched his reflection in the dark glass of a cabinet. He was checking his watch, likely timing my collapse. I realized then that he wasn't acting alone. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text message. My eyes caught the name on the screen before he tucked it away. It wasn't his wife Melissa. He was reporting to a rival firm. I was being sold. The name on his screen was Blackage, our most aggressive competitor. I stood frozen as Jason walked out of the lab. He believed I was a broken woman waiting for the end. I tipped the tainted water into a potted fern by the window. My hands were finally steady as I reached for my encrypted satellite phone. I needed an ally who lived outside the family circle. I called Henry Cole, my oldest supplier. He answered on the third ring. "Henry, I need a ghost crew tonight," I whispered. I explained that the warehouse inventory had to be swapped. He didn't ask questions because he knew the weight of a legacy. We made a plan to move the rare essences to a secure vault. I felt a surge of adrenaline as we coordinated the logistics. Jason was upstairs sleeping, unaware that his prize was evaporating. I hung up and felt the weight of my husband's ring. I was alone. The next morning, the house felt like a stage set. I put on a silk shawl and sat in the sunroom. My movements were slow and deliberate to maintain the ruse. Jason and Melissa joined me for breakfast, looking refreshed and cheerful. They spoke about the future as if it were a gift they were giving me. I listened to their lies while I stirred my tea. I kept my gaze fixed on the blooming garden outside. "The board meeting is at 10. Jason said while checking his cufflinks. He laid the power of attorney papers on the mahogany table. I picked up the silver pen and let my hand shake. I watched his eyes widen with greedy anticipation. He thought he was watching me sign away my soul. I scribbled my signature, but I purposefully missed a crucial line. I needed to buy one more hour of confusion. He didn't even notice. We arrived at the corporate headquarters in a black sedan. The building was a tower of glass that felt like a prison. Jason led me through the lobby, holding my arm with excessive force. He whispered that everything would be easier soon. I leaned into his support, playing the part of the fading matriarch. The elevators ascended silently to the executive floor. I caught my reflection in the chrome. I looked old, tired, and absolutely dangerous. The boardroom was filled with men who smelled of expensive tobacco and arrogance. Representatives from Blackage sat across from our directors. They looked at me with clinical indifference, as if I were a ghost. Jason took his seat at the head of the table. He began the presentation by detailing my supposed health decline. I sat quietly and watched the clock on the wall. The warehouse transfer was complete. I was now sitting in a room full of empty promises. "Before we finalize the merger, my mother has a request," Jason announced. He looked at me with a smirk that chilled my blood. He pulled a small, unlabeled vial from his pocket and set it down. He claimed it was a new prototype I had developed during my illness. He wanted me to identify the notes in front of the board. He was testing the very receptors he had spent weeks destroying. My heart stopped. He was changing the plan. The vial sat on the polished oak like a silver bullet. Jason's eyes gleamed with a cruel curiosity as the board leaned forward. He was deviating from the script to humiliate me publicly. If I failed this test, my medical incompetence would be recorded in the official minutes. I reached for the glass with a hand that I forced to wobble. The air in the room felt thick and recycled. Every man at the table watched my every move. I uncapped the bottle and brought it slowly to my nose. My olfactory system was still recovering from his chemical assault. I took a shallow breath, searching for a single recognizable note. At first, there was only a dull, metallic void. Then, a sharp scent of ozone and synthetic musk pierced through the haze. It was a crude mixture, likely something Jason had cobbled together from the waste bins. He was waiting for me to name a ghost. "It has notes of bergamot and perhaps a hint of white ginger." I lied smoothly. I kept my voice soft and hesitant, mimicking my earlier confusion. Jason's smile widened as he looked at the Blackage executives. He whispered that I was clearly guessing based on old formulas. He believed he had proven my mind was gone. The executives began to whisper among themselves. They were convinced that the House of Whitmore was a hollow shell. I set the vial down and looked directly at the lead executive. His name was Sterling, and he had a reputation for ruthlessness. I noticed a small flash drive protruding from his laptop. My pulse quickened as I realized they were already preparing the digital transfer. I needed to shift the power back to my side of the table. I asked Sterling if he had personally inspected the inventory at our primary warehouse. He looked surprised. My team confirmed the barrels are sealed and ready for transport, Sterling replied. He sounded bored, as if the physical product were a mere formality. I allowed a small, knowing smile to touch my lips. Jason stiffened in his chair, sensing a change in the atmosphere. I told them that a seal is only as good as the contents within. I suggested we call the warehouse manager for a live video verification. Jason's face went pale. He tried to interrupt, claiming we were wasting valuable time for the merger. He grabbed my arm again, his grip now bruising and desperate. I didn't flinch or pull away this time. I looked him in the eye with a coldness that made him stumble back. The board members were now genuinely curious. They sensed a crack in the perfect narrative Jason had built. I reached into my purse and pulled out a different flash drive. I told the room that I had a video of my own to share. I explained it was a security briefing from the previous night at the restaurant. Jason's eyes darted toward the door. But the security team I had hired was already there. He reached for the legal papers on the table, trying to tear them. My heart hammered as the monitor on the wall roared to life. It wasn't the restaurant footage. It was something else. The screen displayed a high-definition view of our main production floor from 3 hours ago. I watched the Blackage executives lean in as the timestamp ticked forward. On the video, Jason walked through the rows of silver vats with 2 men I didn't recognize. They weren't employees. They were wearing industrial jumpsuits and carrying heavy equipment. Jason pointed to the master cooling system. He was showing them how to bypass the internal sensors. The room went silent as he laughed. "What is this, Madam Whitmore?" Sterling asked, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Jason, who was now trembling visibly. I didn't answer immediately. I let the visual of my son sabotaging his own inheritance sink in. Jason finally found his voice and shouted that the footage was a deepfake. He looked around the room for an ally, but Melissa was staring at the floor. She knew the game was over. The board members began to stand up. "It is a record of your true intentions," I said, finally standing straight. My voice was no longer thin or shaky. I explained that Jason had planned to ruin the current batches, to lower the valuation. He wanted a kickback from Blackage for delivering the company at a discount. The executives from the rival firm looked at each other with sudden doubt. They hadn't signed the final papers yet. They realized they were dealing with a liability, not an asset. Sterling closed his laptop with a sharp snap. He told Jason that the deal was suspended pending a full forensic audit. The air in the room shifted from corporate greed to cold panic. Jason lunged for the flash drive in the monitor, but a security guard blocked his path. He turned to me with a face twisted by hatred and desperation. He called me a senile old woman who didn't understand the modern market. I smiled. "I understand that a nose never lies," I replied calmly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the lab report from my blood test. I laid it on the table for everyone to see. I explained the presence of the receptor blockers and the vials I found in my home. The board members gasped as they realized the scale of the crime. This was no longer a business dispute. It was an attempted murder of my career. The doors at the back of the room opened. I expected the police, but instead, my warehouse manager Henry Cole walked in. He was carrying a small glass vial filled with a brilliant blue liquid. He looked at me and nodded once. He told the board that the entire inventory had been moved to an offshore vault. The barrels Jason had sabotaged were filled with nothing but salt water. The value of Whitmore Alier was safe. Jason had nothing. Jason slumped into his chair, the fire finally leaving his eyes. He looked small and defeated against the backdrop of the city skyline. I felt a pang of motherly grief, but I pushed it down. The truth was heavier than any lie he had told. Just as I prepared to call the authorities, Sterling spoke up. He revealed that Blackage had already paid Jason in advance. The money was gone. Jason looked up with a new, terrified realization. The silence in the room was heavy with the weight of stolen money. Sterling stood over Jason like a judge delivering a final sentence. He explained that the advance was $5 million, wired to an offshore account in the company's name. Jason's eyes darted to Melissa, but she was already backing toward the door. The realization that he had gambled with a rival's capital made his breathing shallow. He was no longer just a bad son. He was a thief in debt to wolves. Panic finally set in. I stepped forward and placed the restaurant footage on the table again. The screen showed the waitress, Lily, locking the door and whispering her warning. I told the board that this was the moment I stopped being a victim. My voice felt like cold iron in the quiet room. I explained that I had already filed a police report for the attempted poisoning. Jason looked at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He had underestimated my will to survive his cruelty. "You can't do this, Mom," he stammered, his voice cracking like dry wood. He pleaded for mercy, claiming the pressure of the business had driven him to madness. I watched his face, and saw the same manipulation he used in the lab. It didn't work on me anymore. The smell of his fear was almost tangible now, sharp and acidic. I told him that mercy was for mistakes, not for calculated betrayals. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back into the light. Sterling checked his phone, and announced that the wire transfer had been traced. The money hadn't stayed in Jason's account for more than an hour. It had been moved to a shell company owned by Melissa's brother. The turn was sudden and brutal. Jason spun around to face his wife, his mouth hanging open in shock. Melissa didn't even blink. She had played her own game, siphoning the advance through her brother, while Jason focused on the poisoning. The predator had been hunted by his own partner. The board members began to mutter about legal indemnification. They wanted to distance themselves from the wreckage of the Whitmore family. I watched the power shift from the men in suits back to me. I was the only one in the room who still held the formulas. Without my nose, the company was just a collection of glass and debt. I told them the merger was officially dead. I would keep my legacy. The executives looked at the floor in a long silence. A detective entered the room, his boots clicking on the marble floor. He didn't look at the board or the executives. He went straight to Jason and read him his rights. The handcuffs made a sharp, metallic sound that echoed off the windows. Jason didn't fight back this time. He looked hollowed out, a shell of the man who had laughed on the video. I felt a single tear track down my cheek. I let it fall without wiping it away. Melissa was stopped at the door by a second officer. Her composure finally broke as she was informed of the conspiracy charges. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. I realized then that she was the one who had sourced the chemicals. She was the architect of the slow death Jason had been delivering. I turned my back on her and looked out at the city. The sun was beginning to set over the river. Henry Cole walked to my side and offered a steadying arm. He whispered that the trucks were ready to return the inventory to our labs. I thanked him, but my mind was already on the next steps. I needed to find Lily and ensure her safety and future. She was the reason I was still standing in this room. The company needed a new kind of apprentice. I watched the police lead my only son away. The elevator doors slid shut with a final hum. The room cleared out until only I remained with the empty chairs. The mahogany table was covered in discarded papers and cold coffee. I picked up the vial Jason had used to test me. I uncapped it and poured the liquid onto the carpet. It didn't smell like roses or ginger anymore. It smelled like the truth. I felt my lungs expand fully for the first time in months. The weight of the lie had been lifted. I was free. I walked out of the building and into the cool evening air. The city was alive with sounds I had ignored for far too long. I reached into my purse and felt my phone. The small object that saved my life. I called a car and gave the driver the address of the restaurant. I wasn't going there for dinner or a phone. I was going there to keep a promise to a girl who saw a crime. A new formula was already forming in my mind. The restaurant was quiet when I returned, smelling of lemon wax and old regrets. Lily was buffing the brass railing near the entrance, her movements stiff with anxiety. She looked up and dropped her cloth when she saw me standing there. I didn't look like the trembling woman she had saved in the storage room. I walked with the stride of a founder who had reclaimed her kingdom. I told her the police had taken Jason. She didn't cheer. She just let out a long breath. We sat at the same table where the betrayal had been recorded. I placed my phone between us as a reminder of our shared secret. I told her that the company was going through a massive restructuring phase. I needed someone with an eye for truth and a soul that couldn't be bought. I offered her a position in the lab as my personal assistant and apprentice. She stared at me in total silence for a minute. Her eyes welled with tears of pure shock. "I don't know anything about perfume," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I told her that I could teach her the science of scent. But I couldn't teach someone integrity. She had proven her character under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was my first collection of formulas from over 30 years ago. I pushed it across the white tablecloth. It was a bridge to a new life. A shadow fell over the table, and I looked up to see the restaurant manager. He looked nervous, glancing toward the locked front door. He told me that a man had been asking for me in the parking lot. My pulse spiked as I thought of Jason's associates at Blackage. I thanked him and stood up, motioning for Lily to stay close. We walked toward the exit with a renewed sense of caution. The night air was crisp and smelled of rain. The man waiting by my car was Henry Cole. Looking exhausted but triumphant, he held a thick file of documents that had been recovered from the Blackage offices. He told me that the $5 million Jason embezzled had already been flagged by the bank. However, there was a deeper problem hidden in the paperwork. It wasn't just a merger they were planning. They were trying to patent my husband's original base notes. They wanted to erase our family name entirely from the history of fragrance. I felt a cold rage settle into my bones as I read the filings. Jason hadn't just sold the company, he had tried to sell our history. I realized that my son had been working with the rival firm's deep agents for years. The poisoning wasn't a sudden desperate act. It was the final phase of a long-term plan to liquidate my life's work. Henry pointed to a signature at the bottom of a secret contract. It was dated 2 years ago. The betrayal started much earlier. I looked at the dates and felt a wave of nausea. 2 years ago, I was mourning my husband and trusting Jason with the keys to the vault. He had been planning my removal while I was at my most vulnerable. Every holiday and every dinner had been a calculated performance for his benefactors. I turned to Henry and told him to call our lawyers. We weren't just defending a company now. We were going to war for our very identity. We drove to the secure vault to inspect the returned inventory. The facility was a fortress of concrete and high-tech security. I walked past the rows of steel barrels, feeling the vibration of the cooling systems. I stopped in front of the master vat containing our signature essence. I reached out to touch the cold metal. This was the heart of Whitmore Alier. I realized that the physical product was safe, but the legal battle would be brutal and long. The lawyers met us at midnight in a glass office overlooking the dark city. They explained that the patent filing was a serious threat to our future production. If Blackage succeeded, I would be sued for using my own formulas. I sat in the leather chair and felt the weight of my 64 years. I was tired of fighting, but I couldn't stop now. I told the team to find a loophole. We needed a way to prove the origin of the scent. As the meeting dragged on, I noticed a small detail in the original blueprints. My husband had hidden a chemical marker in the base notes that only we knew. It was a molecular signature that acted like a fingerprint in the liquid. I stood up and told the lawyers we had the proof we needed. Blackage couldn't steal what they didn't fully understand. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my house. The photo of my front door was a chilling warning from the shadows. I didn't panic or cry out. I showed the screen to Henry and watched his jaw tighten in the dim office light. The Vipers were losing their legal grip, so they were turning to physical intimidation. I told the lawyers to stay in the building while we handled the security breach. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene waiting for a match. I had to protect the lab. We reached the estate just as a black SUV sped away into the mist. The front window was shattered, glittering like diamonds on the dark porch. I stepped over the glass and went straight to my husband's old desk. I didn't care about the jewelry or the electronics. I pulled the hidden lever behind the molding to reveal the original scent logs. These notebooks contained the molecular markers that would destroy Blackage in court. I clutched the leather to my chest. My hands were finally warm. They didn't find the safe, Henry whispered from the hallway. He was checking the security feeds on his tablet. The intruders had been looking for digital files, not handwritten history. I realized then that my age was my greatest tactical advantage. They expected everything to be stored on a server they could hack. They didn't understand the power of ink and paper. I packed the logs into a fireproof bag and turned toward the door. We had to move the evidence now. As we headed back to the car, a second realization hit me. The mercy Jason spoke of at dinner wasn't just about the company. He wanted me in a facility, so they could search the house at their leisure. My son had been a scout for the very people who just broke my windows. I felt the last chord of maternal loyalty snap in my heart. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a survivor of a war he started. I told Henry to drive to the precinct. The detective looked at the secret notebooks with genuine awe. I explained the chemical fingerprint that proved my ownership of the brand. This evidence would link Blackage to industrial espionage and theft. I signed the sworn statement with a steady, flowing script. Jason was already in a cell, but now his benefactors would join him. The law was finally catching up to the greed. I felt a strange sense of peace as the sun rose. The long night was finally over. But the justice system was just beginning its work. I returned to the lab and found Lily waiting by the door. She had spent the night cleaning the vats and preparing the raw materials. I looked at the glass and the steel and felt the scent of jasmine returning. My nose was healing, and my legacy was secure in new hands. I realized that family is a choice we make every single day. I opened the notebook and began to teach her. I could finally smell the future, and it was sweet.